The New Hollywood era refers to the movement in American cinema which took place within the mid-1960s and early 1980s. This period of time brought many new faces and creative minds to Hollywood. Some popular actors at the time were Jane Fonda, Al Pacino, Meryl Streep, Robert De Niro, Jack Nicholson, and who most considered to be the most prominent of the time, Clint Eastwood. That's just to name a few. Directors like Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, Roman Polanski, and George Lucas, which are all directors that are still very well known and some still critically acclaimed to this day, began getting traction in Hollywood during this era. So it was a big deal. As a quote from Fievel puts it, New Hollywood emerged as a reaction against the studio system that dominated filmmaking in the early 20th century, allowing for more personal and experimental storytelling. These directors are what made the era of New Hollywood so important to the modern film industry. But why? What did they do that was so different from what old Hollywood was doing? During the golden era of cinema, movie theaters were extremely popular and therefore very profitable. Major companies were constantly producing movie after movie in order to continue bringing in money. After the fall of the studio system, viewership went down and theaters were no longer as popular as they once were. The rise of television in the 1950s also played a huge factor in decreasing the profitability of theaters. And then in the 1960s, a new generation of actors, writers, and directors came along. They had new, innovative ideas and ways of storytelling that weren't solely for the purpose of the films being profitable. It was experimental because there was now room in the industry for people like these who wanted to tell their stories and portray themes in ways that were groundbreaking at the time. While many sources differ from one another on what specific movie had started this movement, the two most prominent answers to this question are almost always Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde and Mike Nichols' The Graduate, both of which came out in 1967. First, let's talk about Bonnie and Clyde. Directed by Arthur Penn, this film is based on the real-life story of outlaw couple Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. With graphic violence and explicit scenes, it depicts their crimes and even somewhat romanticizes their story. This film was met with success in both profits and acclaim. To this day, it is considered revolutionary for being one of the first in Hollywood to depict violence and murder with graphic realism. The Graduate is a critically acclaimed romantic comedy drama from director Mike Nichols, which ended up being the highest-grossing film of 1967. The release of these two marks the beginning of New Hollywood. In the next year, 1968, a new rating system was put in place. Movies could now be rated R and X. A few other iconic movies came out during this year were Rosemary's Baby, directed by Roman Polanski, Night of the Living Dead from director George A. Romero, and 2001, A Space Odyssey from director Stanley Kubrick. The 1970s brought many iconic movies, so here's one notable one from each year. Dirty Harry by Don Siegel, The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola, The Exorcist by William Friedkin, Blazing Saddles by Mel Brooks, Jaws by Steven Spielberg, Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese, Star Wars A New Hope by George Lucas, The Deer Hunter by Michael Cimino, and Alien by Ridley Scott. During the New Hollywood era, several technological advancements were made in attempts to revive viewership. These advancements included the use of widescreen, 3D, and stereo sound in theaters to try and attract audiences. And while these were popular and impressive, they still couldn't quite bring back the same popularity to theaters that they had during the Golden Age.